When you're writing a cookbook, it might be up to you to pay for photography, and that can come with some serious sticker shock. Today, we're going to talk about it. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. This is Kristin Donnelly, and I'm here with Molly Stevens. Hey, Molly.
Hey, Kristin.
I feel like this is just one very opaque part of the cookbook process, which is how the photography gets made.
And who pays for it, right?
Yeah.
And how much it's going to cost. I mean, in most cases, it's coming out of the author's advance, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not always the case. I have worked on contracts where the publisher actually handles all of it and the author gets a lower advance because of it. But then, other times you get this big, seemingly big sum of money, perhaps from your advance, but a lot of times you need to hold it back to pay for photography. And sometimes you're holding it back for months or even like a full year.
And I've worked on projects where the photography is included in the advance on the contract, the number that, shows up on the contract.
Mm-hmm.
But the publisher pays it out to the photographer. So
but you still need to earn it back.
So it's this weird thing where your advance ends up not being as high as you think it is, yet you owe it back. So your royalties are more protracted. Like you said, it's very opaque. There are a lot of ways it works, but I don't want to say it's designed to make the author not know what's going on, but it takes a pretty savvy author to understand.
Yes, like a sort of a business minded or somebody who's at least comfortable with like the personal finance aspect of it. Because, you're talking about the publisher paying out the photographer. There are times when the author actually gets the money and they're expected to pay for photography from that. And so the reason we're doing this episode is because last spring there was a thread on Threads from a photographer named Clay Williams. He posted something that sparked a lot of conversation, and he said, I photograph cookbooks and would love it if publishers were willing to pay for more photography. But A, it is expensive, and B, it's not the publishers paying. It all comes from the author's advance.
And it's getting more expensive.
Yes.
Because everybody's costs are going up, and the demand for photographs is going up. People have an expectation that cookbooks have even more photographs.
Yeah, some people want a photo for every recipe. But just for example, I've received an estimate from an editor that they expect food photography to cost about $600 to $700 per shot.
And that's total. That's everything involved.
That's total. That's all in. So that's a photographer. And Clay gets into this in his thread, and I'm sure we'll talk to him about it today. But you're paying for a lot of people, like a lot of people's work, very skilled labor. So food stylists, prop stylists, photographers' assistants, studio rental, huge. Mm-hmm. So you have space and team that you need to pay for. Clay estimates at least $5,000 a day, it can be a little bit less depending on, how many shots you're doing a day. But in any case, it's very expensive. Like if you're looking at shooting 100 recipes.
Yeah, and realistically, maybe you can get 10 shots a day, 8 to 10, depending on the complexity of the food.
Yeah, I've heard of some people just going for it and doing like 12 to 14, but that's usually very simple food. Yeah. If you're doing drinks, sometimes you can do a lot more, like even up to 20 a day.
But if you're trying to shoot like 100 photographs for your book, it's a lot of money.
That's a lot. So our guest today is Clay Williams. He's a James Beard Award-winning photographer who has been covering food, hospitality, and the people that define our culture for more than 15 years. His work has appeared in the pages of Food and Wine, the New York Times, Bloomberg, Travel and Leisure, as well as in many cookbooks, including cookbooks by Chef Kwame Onwuachi, the late Gullah matriarch Miss Emily Meggett, who we did a show with before she passed, Atlanta chef Todd Richards, and Oakland chef Crystal Wapapa. I remember when I lived in New York City, I saw Clay's photo credit everywhere. He was just always shooting for restaurants, online and in print. But Clay is also the co-founder of Black Food Folks, a platform for Black professionals working in food, service, and food media. And this group has provided space for members to meet, collaborate, and share their stories. So without further ado, let's bring on Clay. Welcome, Clay. Thank you for being here at Everything Cookbooks.
Thanks for having me.
We've been talking about doing this interview for a long time because back in the spring last year, you put up a thread about the realities of photography, specifically cookbook photography. You kind of talked a little bit about what you thought cookbook authors should know. And so that's really what we want to talk about. When a cookbook author is reaching out to a photographer, what do you wish they knew before they did that?
I mean, there's so much. I'm going to try not to be all soapboxy, but like, I really
we
feel
love
like,
a soapbox here. We're here for it.
I just feel like the realities of the photo shoot should be discussed before the contract. I've spoken to so many authors who have this sticker shock and just don't understand that that there's a lot of work that goes into it. In the fantasy world, I mean, it's not a fantasy world. Some people have managed to do books where they're shooting the whole thing themselves, where they're doing, it's one or two people there, right? But the reality is, more often than not, you need a team. That team has to get paid. And just an idea of the scale. I kind of hate the way the system is set up now, because the people who know the most about how it works are the publishing companies. They're the ones that could inform people about these things before the contract is signed, but they don't.
Or not enough.
That sticker shock of finding out your photo shoot is going to cost
tens of thousands of dollars. I mean,
right,
let's
exactly.
be real. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, my cookbook day rate is less than a third of my standard day rate. And I think the shortest cookbook shoot I've done was 4 days. The longest was almost 3 weeks. Wow. I mean, I love cookbooks. I love shooting cookbooks. I love being a part of longer term projects. I love, the industry and the people doing this and being able to experiment and be creative in ways that that you can't necessarily do with an article or, a newspaper piece or magazine or something like that. So, I mean, I want to be a part of it, but something that takes that long requires me to not be doing other things, right? The lost income of 3 weeks, sometimes on the road, is significant. And so I have to balance the economics of that. Everybody thinks that I know how to cook these things. I've cooked them. That doesn't mean that you're a food stylist. Stylists in general, but food stylists are magical, right? I mean, I don't do a lot of elaborate sort of fake things. I don't use very many of the tricks outside of maybe something's not cooked all the way through, or there's a little water and glycerin on something to keep things moist. But the way they can arrange things, the way they can set things up, the way they can make everything look just right for the camera, that's a skill. And that's a solid skill. I'm not a stylist. Prop stylist, the same thing.
Clay, when you wrote that thread, which kind of went mini viral, as Kristin was saying, I guess the question is, what inspired you to write that thread? And then you talk about the team, 5 to 8 people.
Yeah.
So the inspiration for the thread, I was mostly just responding to, there was, one of these internet things where people with absolutely no background or understanding of things make very broad statements. Someone said that every cookbook should have a photo for every single recipe that's in the book.
Yeah, sure.
And it's okay, I mean, I suppose in theory, but thinking about that creatively, besides, the stuff I talked about was just about budget, but also just the repetition of certain things. If you're doing variations of unless it's a book about fish, how many different shots of very similar looking dishes that may taste totally different, do you really need? But then the economics of that is that my standard contract usually has us shooting somewhere in the area of 75 recipes and 25 lifestyle, or some balance of 100 photos, where it's 70 to 80 recipes and then the rest being lifestyle. And that takes a lot of time. The rule of thumb that I always learned that I've found to be pretty consistent is I'm going to get through something like 8 recipes in a day. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we can go a little over, sometimes we go under. But if you're going to do that for everything in a book, that's going to take a lot more time. And, sometimes you can get some group shots of multiple dishes on a table or something like that. But it takes time and it takes work. Besides my time in the studio or wherever we're doing a shoot, I have to spend sometimes likely around a month, dealing with edits of going back through all of the images. A food stylist has days of prep that they have to do ahead of time. And sometimes if it's a longer shoot, we'll have to stop in the middle to do another day of prep. Prop stylists, I think, are often the most like overlooked because what they do is crazy. They're getting things from all over to make sure that you're not flipping through a book that's every dish on the same counter, right? That's not like visually monotonous and over looking like it's in the same space at the same time of year.
And often those professionals have assistants as well.
Yeah, they do.
And
they do.
With good reason.
Yeah, absolutely. My food stylists almost always have another set of hands to do a lot of the actual cooking while they're with me, styling and arranging for the camera and all of that. I worked on a book earlier this year where the prop stylist brought a truck full of stuff. And it was wild and unexpected, but we had some amazing material to work with. But if she hadn't had her assistant with her, you know, we'd have spent the entire time just looking for stuff, just digging to find the things for any given shot. And never mind packing up after it's all done. For me, you know, a standard shoot is, it's me, I need an assistant because I can't juggle all of it myself. The food stylist assistant, prop stylist assistant. And then usually the author is there, if not through the entire shoot, for most of it, to make sure that it's all fitting their vision, right? People go back and forth on this, but I've worked on a few projects where an art director from the publisher will at the very least be there for a couple days, or maybe the co-author. And I welcome having those voices there so that like we're all collaborating on it, right? It's not just what I think it should look like. It's not just, you know, my vision of somebody else's story. I had a very bad experience. I had multiple bad experiences trying to get into shooting cookbooks through the years, but one in particular where it would have been my first book, and I got brought in literally 3 days before the shoot.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, geez.
The author had published before, but the publisher had done all of the work, and this time they thought, well, I want to do it, and how hard could it be, because they did it just fine. Mm-hmm. I hadn't done mood boards. I hadn't done any of that. I hadn't connected with anyone at the publisher until the shoot started. I didn't have a stylist because the author thought that they could do it all themselves. And plates would start coming out. And, you know, it's not like, you know, I shoot restaurants for the Times. I shoot food in a lot of different places, but a book is permanent, right? Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things where we really need to make sure that like we're fitting the larger vision of the whole project. I ended up shooting for a good couple days before I was told afterwards that the publisher basically couldn't use any of it. They ended up bringing in somebody else, and it was somebody else that they had worked with before, and so they were all already on the same page and knew how to make it work. You know, it was one of the very many times I've said, I'm never shooting cookbooks again. And it was, you know, it was kind of a nightmare. It really felt like on my end, it felt like I wasn't good enough to do this job, but really I was set up to fail in a lot of ways because I didn't have any of the background or information or support. Right.
Support for the team.
Yeah.
A question we wanted to ask about production, like setting it all up. How does that work? Are you involved with the publisher? Are you involved with the author? Like, how's that team being built? The location being scouted, all of that?
So it's different each time.
Okay.
I like having a bit of control over these things, but it was never my intent to be the de facto production manager for these things. But it is, in my experience, the way that almost every project I've worked on has ended up being. And that's fine because it's just a thing where it's like, okay, now I understand that this is stuff I need to do. But when someone reaches out to me for a quote, a lot of times they're just telling me what needs to be shot, and then I need to come up with a quote that can make that all work, which means I'm the one that needs to find a location. I'm the one that needs to find the team. And then I need to put together a quote based on how much I think those things will cost. And that can be tenuous because, if somebody says we need to shoot 75 recipes but doesn't tell you what those recipes are, a food stylist is going to say, well, I think it could be this, but it could be a lot more. I had a situation like that a little while back where, the question was like, okay, we have this number of recipes and we have names of the recipes. And it turned out that like all of the recipes seemed sort of luxe. Like there was steak, there was, there was seafood. There were a lot of things that were going to need more budget. That's not even necessarily, that's not volunteered at the request for the quote. And so I just go in saying, okay, 75 recipes we're going to do in this number of days. Then it turns out that like the entire book is made of like champagne and caviar.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Like a grain book is going to be a little different than a champagne and caviar book in terms of ingredient costs.
Exactly.
But you're trying to give a quote based on
the
whole thing. Interesting.
Yeah, which I don't love.
I would almost challenge you to maybe to not do that. Well,
yeah, I've been in situations where the publisher or the author like has a space or, knows some people that they can work with. But in most situations, that's not their area.
Like instead of paying for studio rental, they're like,
Right.
oh, we can go to my cousin's apartment in Lower East Side.
or the Airbnb,
It's got great light.
which
Yeah.
I've totally tried that as to help people out. And food stylists are like, no.
But so if you're quoting it, then are you getting paid the lump sum and then it's on you to pay out everybody involved?
Right, which is another thing. I don't really love the tax implications I have to deal with for then becoming like the employer of contractors and the whole other thing. But
in some cases, is it the author the one who's...
in theory, as far as I understand, and I mean, I've never seen an author contract, but as far as I understand, it is all sort of the responsibility of the author. But I think most agents I've talked to are trying to pass that off as much as possible and say, we want to pay a lump sum to get this project done.
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily know a stylist or a location or any of that. And usually if an author is volunteering a location, it is not an appropriate location. It's usually their house or, a friend's place or something like that. I mean, I use lighting, but like I am by nature more of a natural light person. And so like bigger, spaces with like bigger windows and a lot of light that we can work with through a day, like is always a preference for me. Doing it in a New York apartment, I've not seen it work.
Yeah, that truckload of props hauling them up. Yeah.
Yeah. Another one of the big expenses is a studio. In New York, I have not seen a studio that costs less than $1,000 a day. I have a relationship with a place where if it goes over a certain number of days, I can get a discount. But for the most part, that's what you're talking about.
I've heard people say, well, let's do it out somewhere else. But then you got the whole team that's traveling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
you're paying for that,
Yeah.
too.
And I mean,
So-
I've done that too. I've flown out to a couple places. When we photographed Gullah Geechee Home Cooking, that was me and my team flying to South Carolina. We did the first half of that book in Miss Emily's house, which it was a little bit of a challenge. We were definitely on the porch a couple times trying to get some nice light. And the second half was at a friend's beach house, which had great light. And I mean, I have to say, there are worse places to have to work. But yeah, there were some challenges involved. And, in that case, the family arranged the lodging for us and things like that. But there are parts of it of that budget that I still have to sort of juggle and manage and deal with paying out. I've worked with certain publishers where they will pay out the team directly if we're getting paid from the publisher instead of the author. But usually when I'm working with the author is trying very hard to just have one bill that they're accounting for and having the rest of it be managed by me.
Like you were just pointing out that when you try to save money in one area, it inevitably balloons in another area.
Right.
Have you seen ways that can save money but still keep the creative vision alive and the quality high? Or is it really just something you think like authors need to accept and then advocate for when they're signing a contract?
I think when it comes down to it, it's that the contracts need to be more realistic in accounting for the budget that is going to be required. Because publishers know how much it costs. I mean, they're working on a lot of books. It's not really a surprise. And in a lot of cases, they're making particular demands on what needs to be photographed, on which dishes, on what it should look like, on where things should be. It's officially up to the author, but I've been in situations, or I've heard of situations where the author's more budget-friendly approach is overruled, but it's coming from a budget that is already set, right? So it just doesn't feel like a very fair system, the way things are set up. You know, I do think that authors should be able to be involved and have the choices of who they work with. But, you know, at the end of the day, this is not their jobs. This is not what they spent, you know, years working on to be a production manager, to be, you know, the person that knows how all of those things go. And even if they do a book every year, every couple of years, they're still not going to be an expert in that part of things because that's not their job, right?
Right.
I think the best situations are usually the ones, at least financially, are usually the ones where the publisher is a little bit more on hand with managing the funds and saying like, okay, this is what we want, and we want to try to, not in a way that they're pushing down how it should be on the author, but like they're an active part of the process, and especially the funding.
Yeah, because sometimes it does feel a little bit like, all right, like the publisher like hands it off.
And as you say, the author doesn't have that experience.
Right, often, yeah. Although I will say about that whole thread, I did manage to get trolled by Nigella Lawson, which was amazing.
I actually missed that part. Oh my gosh.
She said something about how they always do the photos in her house.
I mean,
and images for every, you know, for every recipe. She doesn't see what the big deal is. And it's like, that's amazing.
Yeah. Wow.
Because of course you don't.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Because you're Nigella Lawson. Okay.
Right.
I remember being on one shoot and somebody had ordered lunch. And I remember the author realizing too late into it that they were paying for that lunch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, lunch is another of those things.
Yeah.
I worked with another photographer who told me after she had done a particular shoot, like that she didn't realize that the photographer was supposed to pay for lunch. And I said, you're absolutely not supposed to pay for lunch. Right. But apparently she did for the entire shoot. At the end of the day, like those are expenses. And if I'm paying for that, like I am going to be billing them back to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But again, it was a question like, somebody just should have said, this lunch is going on the whole budget.
But nobody ever thinks about that.
But nobody says it. And then
Right.
you're looking at the line item and you're like, holy shit, I just bought lunch for everybody. And I mean, it's important that the team is happy and well fed. But this author would have brought a picnic lunch for everybody if they knew that was happening. Yeah. Yeah,
that's never one of the things. And I mean, I don't think it's one of the things I ever think about to put on a quote. I don't consider that one of my responsibilities for the gig. But it is something everyone has to eat. I mean, we're sitting there surrounded by food every day. We need, I think some of the worst shoot days are when, you know, you go in hungry. Right? Like if you didn't get breakfast because, you know, someone set an 8:30 call time, which is usually me setting an 8:30 call time. I am not a morning person, but I want to, you know, get in while we have light. You know, those days are the hardest. It's one of those things.
Yeah. I've been in situations where authors are like, we're surrounded by food. Like, why are we not eating this food? Right.
Right.
And sometimes you do.
Sure.
But sometimes it hangs out a long time.
And sometimes that food has had 20 hands on
Exactly.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's had 20 hands. It's hung out a long time.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like a smaller portion. You need to feed 10 people, you know. So I've definitely been on shoots where people like might graze on things from the set just to try it if it hasn't been overhandled. But it's true. Like sometimes food's very handled to make it look awesome and you don't want to eat that.
And it's not the food stylist's job to be cooking lunch for everybody.
Right.
That's
also true.
Two separate things. I mean, I don't want to go down this lunch rabbit hole, but in terms of like understanding the expenses,
no, it's true.
It is a line item that that can add up over 7-10 days, whatever it is.
Yeah,
for sure.
and it can be shocking.
Well, it's a creative enterprise. I mean, it's hard work, but you're also trying to create something beautiful. And if people aren't, beyond just being well fed, but being in a comfortable space, having room to work, having all the things that will, nurture a creative environment, it seems like the photographer, I'm just talking to you, Clay, I'm getting a sense that you're kind of the lead for the team in every way.
Right. Which, again, was unexpected.
Yeah.
When I first started. doing all this. And you know, I aspired to shoot cookbooks from when I started out on this whole photography path, I don't know, over a dozen years ago. And yeah, I mean, I always thought of it as another gig where I just come in and I shoot things. But, you know, one of the things that is the hardest, but also like the most interesting parts of shooting books over, you know, the other types of assignments and projects I work on, is that there is this creative collaboration, and I get to be a part of working with like some great people, right? Some really cool people, really creative folks who have their own visual ideas of how things are going to look, about like what things can look like in terms of both consistency throughout, but also like just going beyond like, well, this is what this dish is. You know, working with prop stylists, they can come up with these amazing, wacky, beautiful ideas just based on their collection, on the things that they touch and they see. And it's very exciting. I mean, it's exhausting and stressful and all the other things, but like it's a great experience to be a part of that.
Are you often working with the same team of stylists?
It depends. I mean, I've worked with different folks. The food stylist I've worked with the most is Luciana Lamboy. I think we've shot 4 books now together. Nice. That's here in New York, and she was on the team that I took with me to Edisto. But I've worked with other folks on different projects, depending on budget, depending on who was already brought in. Sometimes the author or whoever has already set some of those things up already. Yeah, I have some people that I really enjoy working with, but always interesting to work with other folks and get a different sort of vibe and feeling. There's the relationship aspect to all of it, right? It's like, it's finding the people that you click with, not falling into like everything is the same, but like, you know, continuing to be creative from project to project. It's a mix, but there are definitely a couple of people I definitely have worked with and hope to work with again.
Why we really wanted to get into this with you is to talk about the financial side of things, the realities of it. But as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about what cookbook authors don't always understand, is that the photos of the food in a well-done cookbook, it's more than just, here's a shot of a plate of pasta. Here's a shot of, you know, you rolling out the pasta. I'm just listening. It's not
75 overhead shots.
Right. I'm just listening to you, Clay, and I'm hearing the sort of creative process of building something that's more than just a string of a bunch of shots, like that board we've all looked at the end of a shoot that's got all the Polaroids up. And how far out are you sometimes booking? And then what's that process like of figuring out how you're going to approach this project, a certain project?
Well, thankfully, I'm not in the 3 days out booking anymore. It depends. The sweet spot, in my experience, has been a minimum of 3 months. It can go further back. We've definitely like booked and arranged things like 5 to 6 months ahead. But I think that somewhere in that 3 month or so window is really nice, because it gives you time to go from the initial like quote question and how are we doing that, to finding a space, finding a sort of common vision, depending on the situation. Sometimes I'll make the mood board. Sometimes I'll get a mood board from the publisher. Sometimes the prop stylist will put together a mood board, which I really like, because like they actually know what everything looks like, you know, in terms of the stuff around it. Mm-hmm. You can have a back and forth over that time without it feeling like, oh my God, we got to get this figured out because we're going to start shooting any minute, right? Thinking about Crystal's book, we shot that from August into September, or mostly in September of last year. And I believe we started the conversation about that in May. So it gave us pretty much the summer to have the initial conversations and have the team together, and then sit and think a little bit. And then come late June, July, to have the real meetings about like, okay, this is what each of these dishes are. This is how we are thinking about it. And in that case, Amy Condon was the co-author. Amy and I had worked together on Todd Richards' book previously. One of the things I've loved actually is working with, and this doesn't always happen, but working with someone like Amy. Amy is very organized about all of it. And Amy puts together like a spreadsheet of all the dishes that we're going to shoot. Notes that are coming both from like her experience having done the research and some of the testing with Crystal, but also some of the, details from the calls and conversations from the mood board, like really collecting those things. And this is not something that everybody does. Sometimes a co-author might just pop in for an hour or two. Sometimes they're there for all of it or some of it. But it's always good to have somebody doing that. Usually if it's not someone like that, it ends up being me. So I appreciate when it's not me. Having that aspect of it is super helpful, and that takes time too. I mean, it makes sense for someone like the co-author who is going through the step-by-step of like having to understand the dishes, having to understand the references in the background, to be able to say, oh yeah, these are notes that are relevant. These are things that make sense. These are things that there should be some sort of visual cue for. That is a part of the process.
We've talked a lot about the challenges, and I feel like we've kind of hinted at the magic that happens on a photo shoot, but I do want to dig into that a little bit.
Sure.
Part of it's like, why would you keep doing this when it is so challenging and you're getting paid less, right? There must be a reason.
I mean, yes, I have to ask myself that a lot. I don't want to just feel like I'm complaining about it, because I do love it. It's like I said before, there's an energy to a cookbook that I just love. I love that collaboration, that feeling that we're all working on this thing together. We can have this back and forth, and there's time for experimenting with visuals in a way that like most of my other projects and assignments are very much, and I love this part too, but they're very much in the moment, right? Like if I'm shooting something for a newspaper article or a story for a webpage about a restaurant, that is a thing where I'm going to be in and out in like an hour or two. They're going to pass through a bunch of dishes. I'm going to get a portrait of the chef. I'm going to do these things. And my due date might be in 2 days. Mm-hmm. That can be exciting. I mean, when I first started out, and this was 2011, 2010, one of my first regular clients was Zagat. And they would have these roundups of, I don't know, the best chicken dishes around the city. And it would be, I would have to go to like 25 restaurants in like 2 or 3 days and just get a picture of a chicken dish, right? A particular one from each place. There's something to that hustle of running around and all of that, but it's not the same thing as being able to, spend time figuring out, what is this going to look like? How are we going to do it? What evokes the spirit of the story behind it? And I love that. I love that part of it. And I love like delving into the lives of the authors. Crystal's book was the most recent, which is why it keeps coming to mind. But I went to Oklahoma with her to see family and photograph her with her family cooking together. We went to a powwow together. I got to really sort of experience that. I spent almost 3 weeks in Oakland getting to know her family there, getting to know, like working with her kids and her team. That immersion is something that like I don't often get the opportunity to experience in my regular work. I'm hoping to do more of that. I want to do more of that. And some of those, will be books, some of them won't. But that's something that I think cookbooks really allow for, is that time scale of this isn't something that needs to be turned around in a week or a day or something like that. It's something that we have sort of luxurious breathing room and sort of timing in doing that.
Well, and the connection that then it engenders, and then that comes through the lens onto the page, because you built this relationship with the author and their story and the food. And I'm just thinking back to what we started this conversation, and having been an author and been on shoots that have gone well and haven't gone well, and been co-author likewise. And the ones that haven't gone well, my early ones where I didn't understand that I was paying for everything, took something that should be really joyful and like this culmination of this years of work to create, and you're in this very important part of the creative process that could take this book from one place to a whole nother place. And if as an author you're just completely bowled over the fact that it's costing this much and you don't know where you're going to go and you're totally stressed out about that, it kind of wrecks it. definitely detracts from it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why I think that it should be part of it. It should be discussed earlier in the process, because the idea that this is just shocking to everybody and all you're thinking about is like, oh my God, this is going to bankrupt me, right? Like, is not where you want to be going into this, like this major part of the process. I only have control over some of that, which is to say, like, to be able to do everything I can to work with folks to explore what they want out of it, how they want things to look. Like, I think in the conversations I've heard here and in other places, like, I feel like the conversations often end up becoming something like, well, that's something I have to buy. The photos are something I'm buying. It's a purchase, right? And I don't want it to be that. I want it to be a process, and I want it to be an extension of the larger process. I want the cookbook shoot to be this creative moment that is an extension of everything else that you've been working on. It's not me just putting some pictures down of these dishes. It's us making sure that how we put this together fulfills your vision. I photographed last year a cookbook by Charlize Rookwood. She has an online show. She does vegan cooking. She's fascinating. Her book is coming out in May. She is from East London, and her parents are Jamaican and Mauritian, and she's doing vegan food. So she's bringing in all of these types of cuisine and doing stuff that's really creative. You know, these aren't all things that go naturally vegan, right?
Yeah.
But like on our set, my family's Jamaican. Lucy, my food stylist, she has Jamaican in her family. My assistant, his dad's Jamaican. And like, it really felt like this was something that touched on parts of our history. And like, it wasn't just like, okay, we're doing this because this is another assignment. It was something that really, I felt like we connected with, and where each of us have different relationships to the island and the cuisine and the culture and whatever. But like, we were all able to have something that resonated with us and really bring that to the table. I mean, figuratively, literally, right? But like, we were able to say, oh yeah, this dish, you know, this reminds me of something. This feels like something I've had before. And I will happily photograph all sorts of food. I don't want to be just, you know, stuck into one particular area. I've photographed, you know, Kwame Onwuachi's book was an amalgamation of all of his background. Miss Emily's book was very specific about the food of that place. But they all sort of plug into some feeling. And whether you have a background in there or not, you need to be able to connect to that feeling. And I think that is as much a part of the job as anything else, is making it so that you're connecting with your author and everybody else, publishers and the art team and whoever. But like, you have to be able to make that connection in order to really create something that I think is good, right? That's like something that I want to put my name on. I want to be a part of.
What is your advice to up-and-coming photographers?
It's hard. A lot has been talked about, like gatekeeping. I don't know where we stand anymore on any of that, but it's hard because publishers have the folks that they know will do the job as they want it. And they know that they'll be able to get everything they're looking for in the way they're looking for. And it's a big project that you have to work on. And so they're still not very open to trying out new talent. You know, one of the early things that people told me is like, if you want to get into cookbooks, get to know people before they're doing their books who are working on these things, and work with them before that, create relationships with them before that. And that way you can be put in on the proposal, or like you can be a part from the beginning. But, you know, I've been there and I did that. And a friend, this was years ago, tried to put me on as her photographer, and they kicked me back for somebody, you know, who had a bigger name. And he was a friend and he's great. He did good work, but like, I was very young and I was very new to it. So I can't say I would have done a better job. But yeah, I mean, it's still hard. It doesn't seem like that's changed. So I don't have advice for that because I don't know. You know, I've been lucky enough to hit a point where I have enough books under my belt where I'm considered at least somewhat established, but it's still one of these things where I'm still fielding the in some cases, the projects that are underfunded, that are still like, can you make this project happen for $10,000? And I mean, I'm far enough ahead where I can say, no, I can't do that. I'm not going to do that. And you can find somebody else who might be able to make that work. It's not going to look great, but that's fine. It is still hard. I don't know that we've made a lot of progress in terms of making that more accessible. I mean, maybe these are just connecting two things that aren't related, but I hope that if we move to a space where the photography is seen as more a collaboration and less of a price tag, then we get to a point where we start to think of that as being something that's unique and something that's based on those relationships and based on the collaboration and the work together and not
something you buy.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
I guess it's like anything in cookbook publishing where it's just a long game.
Yeah, absolutely.
Getting your work out there, getting people to know you, showing you can, especially because so much of cookbooks, it's not exclusively studio, but there's so much that's in a studio. So proving you have the know-how, stamina, all of that.
Yeah.
And the stakes are high. It's interesting. It brings up a lot.
Yeah. There aren't that many other kinds of work that you can make that fits cookbook work. And so building a portfolio of work before you've actually gotten to do it can be very difficult. Because even if you're doing food shots and lifestyle shots and that sort of thing, I mean, lifestyle may be a little easier because you can have different styles, but food shots, if the other food shots that you're putting in are coming from, from article assignments or commercial assignments or things like that, you're going to have a different vibe and different look from what an art director is really looking for a cookbook. So yeah, I mean, there's work that goes into it, but like, I feel like there's just an opaqueness that happens. Again, I haven't been on the author side of this, but like a lot of times there's not much straightforward information about like why things are the way they are or explaining the process. And so if you're someone new to cookbooks who doesn't know those things, there's not a lot of openness to getting you to a point where you can do it. The idea is, well, the reason we want to go to the same people is because we've already dealt with them and we already know they're going to do these things. We already know they're going to understand the crop and the dimensions and, leaving space in the well for, all these things and having space for text in this place and that place and the stuff that I didn't think about 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Along with all the production stuff you've talked
right.
about.
Yeah, right. I mean, the production stuff, it just sort of happened. It's like, oh, well, it's a good thing I know a couple people, right? I don't think enough has been done to bring up folks who haven't already gotten here.
Well, and I think more conversations like this, and I saw from your thread, you've been invited on, a few people reached out about maybe being on panels and things like that. So I think it's interesting. We hear more and more about cookbook production, but this is a piece I don't hear that much about. So really appreciate you sharing all of this with us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Clay.
Yeah, no problem.
This was a really great conversation.
Yeah. Thanks, Clay.
This is awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. The show is available wherever you get your audio. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. It really helps. Any book mentioned in the show can be found on our affiliate page, bookshop.org. Thanks as always to our editor, Abby Sarcatella. Until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.